Welcome to another of our Wednesday yachting luncheons. Wonderful to be here looking at the beautiful view we get from the grill room. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the historic first ever Commodore female of the St. Francis Yacht Club, Teresa Brander, our first female Commodore.
Thank you, Ron, and another Wednesday yachting luncheon. So great to see really big crowd today. So welcome everyone, members and guests here in the grill room, and those of you who are watching online. We now have that this year of being online, so it's really great to be able to share that with those of you who aren't able to be in the room with us, and also those who don't even live in the area. It's wonderful to share our Wednesday yachting luncheon with you. So today's talk, based on the crowd, is of interest to many, many people. We all want to know what's going to happen, and really looking forward to hear today's presentation from Bob Heller. So great. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. So as we look out the windows today, we're going to say that's maybe 11 knots of breeze, 9 knots of breeze out there. Yesterday, we had some real commotion out these windows. As many of you know, we pioneered 15 years ago. Yesterday was our 15th annual big sail, which is the first ever competition on the water where we have the bands and the First of all, we had to worry about the air. So some of us took precautions. It was fun. We gave masks out to any competitors who wanted them, or Commodores. We also added a fifth division. We added a women's division. And this is, in fact, the winning Stanford women's team that won in the competition. So we had 5 divisions: Grandmasters, Masters, Alumni, Women, and Varsity Sailing. We have the bands. We have a juggler in the lower right-hand corner who also is chief umpire. He's international umpire. And we have, as I started to say, it's the first competition in sailing where we have the normal trappings of a football game or a basketball game. That is to say, the cheerleaders, bands, mascots, etc. And we fill up the whole clubhouse. It was literally sold out weeks in advance. And alumni fill up the stands, and we race sailboats right out here. We were worried that in the light air, match racing might be boring. So this year we introduced another first ever, the first ever slalom course with crewed boats. You've heard of the laser slalom. Jibing a boat and tacking it real rapidly is difficult enough with just one person on the boat, but we did it yesterday with 10 teams of 3 or 4 people each. So they slalomed up and back, and it was quite thrilling. We also had 3 drones, so it was quite an event, and we now know that there is one copy, which we appreciate a lot. It doesn't mean you're doing anything good unless somebody copies you. And now Southern California just introduced their first annual sail-off where they are doing something similar between 2 colleges. And we wish them luck getting the bands and all that, because we want them to do that. And then there's also an email stream that I've been seeing for the last couple of days today about University of Michigan wanting to do a similar event. They have problems with the boats being put away for the winter, but that's a problem for them to deal with, not for us. At any rate, you're welcome to come next year to the big sail. It's totally, totally, totally wild mayhem, and that's always fun. Let's see, a little bit about future speakers. So in, not just because the PICWA, that is the Pacific Interclub Yachting Association, named yours truly Yachting Historian of the Year a week ago, which was a shock and a surprise, but it was quite an honor. Not just because of that, we will have at the beginning of the year in this, for one of our luncheons, a history of the St. Francis Yacht Club, Tinsley Island. So we will have a history of Tinsley Island as spoken by people who were here when the club bought the island back in the 50s, and a whole panel, and we'll do an interview of the panel, etc. And also in January, we will do St. Francis Yacht Club in the 50s by people who joined in the 50s. As you know, if you look in the new directory now, we have members listed not just alphabetically, but in a year-joined portion of the directory, we have members listed by the year they joined the club. So your kind of unknown cousin you can get to meet, somebody who joined the same year you did. So we'll have people from the 50s, and later in the year we'll do the club in the 60s when I joined, etc. So that'll be January programs. In December, you want to come by the a traditional father-son luncheon. We'll have the San Francisco Boys Chorus, scrimshaw makers, shanty singers, the traditional bull and tying contest, and all kinds of fun stuff. A character artist to draw a picture of you and your son. In December 12th, Gary Jobson will be out here. He's pretty much the best ambassador sailing has to the world. Gary has only written 19 books. He'll talk about his most recent when he gets out here. In December also, Christy Nelson, who wrote a book about the World's Fair on Treasure Island, the haunting love story of deception in World War II, and there's a lot of both of those in her book. She'll be here. On the end of November, Mikhail Vinikoff will be here to talk about what GIs can do after they come back from war. His whole Ranger Road program is quite exciting. And next week, Lee Bruno, the author, will be here to talk all about Misfits, Merchants, and Mayhem, Tales from San Francisco's Waterfront. So we have great speakers coming down the pike. A little bit about our speaker today. Born in Germany, in Cologne, Germany, where his family stayed until it had been 90% bombed in the war activities. He has actually a heroic life. He escaped. His family lived in caves as they first went to East Germany and then headed westward and found his way to America in 1960. Right away, he got himself a degree in the middle of the country, where he got a BA in economics at Parsons College in Iowa, and then he would go to University of Michigan, where he got an MA in econ, and then he got a PhD across the way at UC Berkeley in '65. His fast track would take him to teaching at UCLA, where he wrote 5 textbooks, some of which are on this table right here, on the subject of econ. And he began becoming an expert in international relations, went to the International Monetary Fund, chief financial study to run the financial studies activity. And in '79, went to work at B of A for Walter Hoadley. Who remembers how Walter Hoadley is connected to our yacht club? He was a frequent speaker in this podium of the Tuesday yachting luncheon. Many of us were in the room when Walter Hoadley would come and give his annual update on the finances of the country. In '86, President Reagan appointed him as one of the members of the Federal Reserve Board, where he worked first for Volcker and then for Fed Chair Greenspan. In '89, he became president of Visa. All this time he was a sailor, starting with a Santana 22 in LA in '65, and later getting an Erickson 35 that I'm told I have a half interest in some other yacht club. It's the truth. A buddy called me up and said, "Ron, you're my partner." What? Anyway, so I've been on the boat twice, and they're nice boats, Erickson 35s. But he was noticed by another of our great yacht clubs, our parent club, San Francisco Yacht Club. Many of us who belong to both clubs recognize the seniority of the San Francisco, our northern neighbor. And he was in the brain power of that club, quickly selected as an officer and became Commodore in 2011. So it's with great pleasure that I couldn't find a more authoritative speaker to talk on trade, tariffs, and Trump than Bob Heller. Dr. Bob Heller.
Thank you so much, Ron, for the kind introduction. Very much appreciated. I'm also very, very glad, as you said, a lot of friends came over from the San Francisco Yacht Club, and welcome to you all. Really glad that you are able to join me here. So today we have a very topical topic, which will take you back to the college days that Ron was just talking about. Berkeley, Stanford, UCLA, that's where we learned about trade and tariffs. And now we also talk about Mr. Trump. So let's begin. Why are we talking here as yachtsmen about trade? The most important thing to remember about international trade is that it moves mostly in boats. As a matter of fact, 90% of all trade moves in boats. And then I thought, is it really boats or is it ships? Which one is it? Ships. It's not ships, it's boats. Because the difference between a ship and a boat, as you should know, on a ship, they serve cocktails. On a boat, you got to make them yourself. anyhow, if we look outside the window here, we see exactly our international trade problem. From the left, you see ships coming in, heavily laden. They come in low. From the right, typically the ships leave empty, and they ride very high. Now, somebody famous said that recently. When they come in low, we go out high. But I don't think it has too much to do with international trade, and it's the wrong direction in which they're moving. So, here, let's look at our lesson plan. First of all, we start, why is international trade good for all? What are the arguments for tariffs? What's the Trump strategy? Let's do some real macroeconomics, like we all learned in college. And finally, how will it all end? So that's our lesson plan for the day. We start 200 years ago with David Ricardo. In the year 1817, David Ricardo enunciated the principle of comparative advantage, which says that all nations will benefit from trade, even if one has an absolute advantage in every product that is being produced. And the typical example people use to illustrate the thing, if you're a surgeon, if you're a lawyer, you may still employ a secretary to type all your papers, even if you are the best typist, a much better typist than your secretary is. It's the relative advantage that counts, and that's the important thing in international trade, and we have known that for 200 years. Not even Einstein's relative theory of relativity is 200 years old, because Einstein wasn't around. So it's one of the oldest insights of science in general. Think about it. So, free trade benefits all countries. That's the basic proposition. The next thing we learned in college is that a country exports the goods that use much of its abundant resources, or as we said in college, that are intensive in our abundant resource. So what does that mean? For instance, the United States, we may say that we have a lot of land compared to how many people we have. So as a result, the US has a comparative advantage and will therefore export the goods that use a lot of land, like soya beans, cow production, milk, and all agricultural products, other things that use a lot of land. We may also be exporting goods that are very capital intensive, but not goods that are labor intensive. So as a result, the US gains by having higher rents, higher prices in the agricultural sector. And the reverse implication is that labor does not gain all that much from international trade. And if you look at the current debate out there, that is exactly what has happened to the United States. Labor has been felt aggrieved for not benefiting enough from international trade. Here's another proposition that we have. That is that small countries will gain relatively more than large countries from trade. And why is that? It is because in a large country, we can produce almost everything in the United States. Just think, what couldn't we really do without if push came to shove? Think about, like during wartime or something like that, where we were the place that produced everything that the world needed. And a big country can do that. But a small country, think Luxembourg or Switzerland or Monaco or somebody like that, they can't produce cars, they can't produce airplanes, they can't produce most other goods that are needed for daily consumption. And as a result, those countries, they gain relatively more because they have access to the entire world market, and their prices will change more, but they get enormous access to all these internationally produced commodities. So small countries gain more. We have three things we learned. First of all, trade will make all countries better off. Individual groups may gain or lose, and small countries gain more than large countries. Lesson number 2, the arguments for tariff. The biggest argument for tariffs is the so-called infant industry argument. And that's because we all agree that infants need to be protected. And here's my granddaughter, Ivy, who is sitting there being protected. She isn't even a year old yet. So to protect these new industries, these industries which are growing up, countries impose tariffs, countries impose quotas, so that the infant industry can grow up behind that tariff wall and become competitive. A country that is new to the world, think China again, had a lot of growing up to do until they became competitive. But an important part of that infant industry argument is that you have to remove the tariff once the industry grows up. And people forget about that. Countries tend to exploit that argument, and they continue to have the tariffs there, and especially as they start to export these commodities themselves, that infant industry argument is no longer valid. For instance, as an example, look at how other countries took over the US automobile market. Right after World War II, in the 40s, early 50s, the US, everybody was driving a Dodge, a Chevrolet, a Ford, locally, domestically produced car. Then in the 50s, Germany starts to export again to the United States. And they're exporting Volkswagens and Mercedeses and BMWs very, very successfully. In the 70s, the Japanese learned the same trick. And suddenly we have Toyotas, Nissans, Hondas also flooding the US market. In the 90s, the Koreans, Kias, Hyundais, other cars are coming in. And right now, the Chinese are getting ready to start exporting to the US. What happens? Everybody starts to export, and that leads to dumping. What does dumping mean? It means selling below domestic prices, right? Nobody likes dumping, especially not your neighbors. And it's interesting, the World Trade Organization actually allows dumping unless it causes material harm. So a little dumping is okay, but not too much dumping. And that's obviously a fuzzy border, You have a lot of explaining to do there. And in addition, many countries really want to protect their own special industries, especially in Northern California. Think Marin County. Every child is special, right? So countries have special industries. Switzerland loves its Swiss cheese and wants to protect their cows so that they can produce the milk to produce the cheese. The French want to protect their wine. You try to get a bottle of Napa wine into France, good luck to you. The Canadians, their milk industry is important. They have tight quotas on all the milk and milk products. Japanese rice farmers have to be protected for their importance to the Japanese culture and mythology. And we certainly want to have our defense industry protected, because we want to be strong, we want to be able to use all those airplanes and tanks and things that we can produce. So China is a champion in protecting its key industry. Here's the official list of industries that are protected, where the Chinese want absolute control over the industry. Armaments, aviation, coal, finance, petrochemicals, power generation, shipping, telecommunications. You ask yourself, what's left? Can you come up with anything? I have a hard time. But take finance, for instance. Ron said earlier, I used to work for Visa. Foreign Visa cards are accepted in China by Chinese merchants if you want to buy Chinese goods. The Chinese also allow their own residents who are traveling abroad to have Visa cards so that they can go and buy and stay in hotels and so on and not unduly inconvenienced. But Visa is not allowed domestically to issue Visa cards to Chinese that could be used at Chinese shops. The domestic market is totally closed. Now, I just read in the paper last week, they're thinking about allowing an American Express to get into the Chinese market domestically as well. That would be an important step forward, but there's a long, long way to go. So they protect their industries very strongly. And it's also true that world trade barriers are very uneven. Korea, the country on the left side in the graph there, the tariffs on overall is the blue line. The reddish one is agriculture, and the green one on the right is manufactured goods. Korea has extremely high tariffs, especially in the agricultural sector. Chinese manufacturing tariffs are 400% of what US tariffs are for the manufacturing sector. Europe has high agricultural tariffs and quotas and other non-tariff barriers that keep foreigners, especially the United States, basically out of the European market at the present time. Here's the trade with China, the US trade with China, the bilateral trade. And there's a vertical line, and that line shows you when the Chinese joined the World Trade Organization. The top line shows US imports from China, which are running now at over $500 billion coming into the country. US export, the middle line, the blue one in the middle there, US exports are $130 billion a year. So the US has a trade deficit, or the Chinese have a trade surplus with the US of $375 billion a year. And it's been growing rapidly over time. For every dollar we export, the Chinese, for everybody we export, the Chinese export almost $3 to the United States. It's a very unbalanced picture. So what's Trump's strategy? Obviously, he is the ultimate deal maker, the art of the deal. And that's what he wants to do around the world, what he used to do at home with his hotels and his buildings. So how does he do it? If you read his book, number one, threaten the weakest opponent with tariffs in this case. Typically, you pick on the smallest guy out there, the smallest country. So you start with Korea, then you go to Mexico, Canada, then Europe, then finally the big kahuna, China. You escalate the stakes. When the other guy finally yells, "Uncle," then you strike a bargain. And that's what he wants to do internationally as well. Now with Korea, he basically pulled it off. We have a trade deal now with Korea, and as part of that deal, the US gets to export 50,000 cars into the Korean market every year, tariff-free. Well, good luck. I want to see the Koreans who will be buying the Fords and the Chevrolets and the Mustangs to drive around in the little tiny roads of Korea. I hope it works, but I have my doubts. Now here's the really good one. He negotiated to have agricultural quotas and tariffs reduced to 0 over the next 10 years. But what is accepted? Rice. Obviously the stuff they eat for morning, lunch, dinner, they eat their rice. And so the rice will still be protected for the domestic Korean industry because rice is special. There will be no tariffs on Korean steel exports, but there will be a cap of 70% of the steel exports they had in the last 3 years. Now that's actually quite a bit of an accomplishment for the president because it reduces the overall inflow of steel by the Koreans in the United States. So the US steel makers will definitely like that. After the deal with the smallest guys out there, with the Koreans, the next deal he did Mexico and Canada. A couple of things that are almost irrelevant. Canada will no longer put a tariff on the first $150 worth of goods that you are bringing along when you travel across the border up to Canada, so you can take a couple of bottles of wine or, Kentucky whiskey along. Not very much. The U.S. gets access to 3.5% of the Canadian dairy market. 3.5%, little tiny sliver. No tariffs on 57,000 tons of chicken, and no tariffs on 120 million eggs. Sounds like a lot, but there are 30 million Canadians around, right? 30 million Canadians, it means 4 eggs for each Canadian every year, tariff-free. That'll really make a difference, right? The Mexicans, $150 can come in tariff-free into Mexico. Not much else will happen. In return, the U.S. grants no tariffs on 2.6 million cars each from Canada or Mexico. So basically, they have a big presence in the U.S. automobile market. The value content that's domestically produced in the northern American region has to rise to 75%, and a minimum wage of $16 has to be paid on 40% of the car value. It's a victory for American automobile workers, but all the rest of our regular consumers doesn't again make a lot of difference. Not an awful lot has happened in that Mexico-Canadian deal. The next countries to be attacked will be Europe and China. The US started with punitive tariffs on steel and aluminum. The goal is clearly to open up the protected markets, agricultural markets in Europe. And the Germans are already basically starting to throw in the towel. They say, well, okay, German car manufacturers, we are for 0 tariffs on both sides, because they know how many Germans are there that really want to drive around in a Pontiac on the Autobahn when they can't have a BMW that can go 200 kilometers an hour, You try to do that in your Pontiac. China, that's where the big kahuna is. We imposed initially 25% tariff on 34 billion in Chinese exports. In September, we hit another 200 billion. The Chinese retaliated and said, hey, we're strong too, on 60 billion in tariffs. If the trade talks fail at the end of the year, the rest of the trade will be covered by tariffs. And the goal, clearly, by the US is to open up the agricultural markets. We have already lost our total soybean market. Chinese pigs would love our soybeans. They eat Brazilian soybeans, and so it goes. But hopefully, we'll be able to recuperate in these markets. The important thing is to open up service, to open up finance, to open up all these sectors that I earlier talked about, and very important, to protect the intellectual property, things produced in China. I'm looking at some of my friends sitting there in the audience, they know it all too well. If you produce something in China, 2 weeks later, the Chinese are exporting it and copying it, and what do we gain as a result? So, if there's no settlement in the trade dispute, it will be a disaster. If there is a beneficial settlement, we can all agree that everybody will win. But lesson number 4. Now we're going to Econ 1B, all the stuff you didn't learn in Econ 1B. First of all, important thing to remember is there are 2 ways to define national income, gross domestic product. By the total amount we spend on things, or the total amount of income we derive from things that we sell to others. If you look at the income side, it's consumption. We're consuming either something, we're investing something, we're getting money from government, or we're getting money from exports. So that's the total income the country receives, the people in the United States. And then we spend it on consumption, we save it, we spend it on taxes, whether we want it or not, and we spend it on imports. So those two things, accounting-wise, they have to be equal to each other. So look at the C plus I plus G plus X has to be equal to C plus S plus T plus M. And if you rearrange the terms a little bit, you see that the government deficit, government spending minus taxes of $646 billion has to be equal to the trade deficit, which are our imports minus our exports, which are roughly the same amount, 787 billion. That little residual, that's the difference between investment and savings, but it's relatively small. Now, if you want to see the relationship between these two deficits, what I call the twin deficits, here's the graph that shows you the blue line, the dotted line, is the trade deficit, and you see it growing over time, and that mirrors roughly the government deficit of $787 billion, the solid blue line. There are little discrepancies, you know, for instance, especially in 2010, 2011, when we're in a big recession, the government deficit is big. So, but you see this secular trend, and you see roughly how those two deficits parallel each other. So the important thing is, if we don't do anything about our government deficit, there will be a trade deficit. And never mind what else happens on the trade front. So instead of imposing tariffs that distort prices and lead to inefficiencies, the better way to get rid of the trade deficit is by reducing the government deficit, especially by spending less. I'm not for taxing more. We're already spending enough money. Spend less, and as a result, you will also reduce the trade deficit. How will it all end? The Trump plan is basically a tactical plan. He sees the tariff war as a trade skirmish where you fight against each other. And he wants to reduce tariffs to basically inconsequential levels. He wants to eliminate the quotas and other trade barriers on both sides. And he wants to protect the intellectual property that the US has and that others too much copy without paying for it. The better strategy, I would argue, is reduce the trade deficit by reducing the government deficit, and thereby get both of those deficits together to reduce. And that has a very important side effect, because if you reduce the government deficit, the federal debt level will also stop to grow, and hopefully, we can always wish it will start to shrink. And then we can live happily ever after. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Welcome, of course, to our Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. Our speaker today is PhD economist and former governor of the Federal Reserve Board, Bob Hiller. He's also written a memoir, and I know Bob, and he has an incredibly inspiring life story, and you want to read The Unlikely Governor at the bottom of the pile of books here. Not everybody, with such respect, he moves the books around. This is a cool book, and it's a fascinating story, and it's a fascinating story, and the memoir of our speaker is worthy, informative, fun book. Hold it for a second. Can't have these books on the ground like that. Anyway, so Bob, how long did it take to write the book? How long did it take to write The Unlikely Governor?
The Unlikely Governor was about half a year. Actually, I should give credit to my grandchildren and my daughter, because, you know, I have a couple of little grandkids running around, and so I was going to take the whole family over to Europe. And every time I saw them, I would tell them, I said, okay, when we go to Europe, you see the house I grew up in. You see the wine cellar where I used to work as a little kid. You will see the cave that we lived in after the war, which little kids don't want to live in a cave, you know. And so finally my daughter had enough, and, you know, she being a smart lady, she's a professor of medicine at Stanford, she says, Dad, you're always talking about yourself. Why don't you write it all down, and then I can read it to them as a good night story, and they'll fall asleep really well.
Is it effective in that way, Bob?
So it certainly is. So I wrote the first 5 chapters, and I went very fast. And so then I thought, gee, that was great fun. So I just kept going.
Okay, so back to our subject of tariffs. Give us a history of tariffs. While they might have had a different name, what's the first historic incident where a country put what we call now a tariff in place?
Oh, I really don't know. There we would have to go back to ancient history. I mean, you know, people have argued about what to sell and what not to sell ancient times. There must be something in the Bible someplace. Any biblical scholars here? I don't know when the first tariff came about. But it's, you know, basically when nation states were invented, people also started to say, hey, we as a group got to protect ourselves. So it's been around forever and a day. Ricardo didn't invent it 200 years ago.
So if China dropped all tariffs tomorrow, talk to us about what would happen. Give us a timeline of events thereafter. And we'll ask questions. If you have a question for the audience, hold your hand up and we'll come to you. So
I think it would be a great day. If China drops the tariffs, U.S. tariffs are already very low, and then we could drop our tariffs. Hopefully the Europeans would do the same, and then we'd really be well off. Now, clearly there would be dislocations that will happen in the United States, like the Chinese are still able to produce with their comparative advantage goods that are using a lot of labor because they got a lot more people. They got 1.3 billion people running around, and we got 350 million or something like that. So all those people can produce goods. So things that are produced with hand labor, we are probably not all that competitive. But we can fight back, you know, using machines and things like that in the production of our automobiles and so on. So it will be a more open system. Markets will become more competitive, more fluid. Just think about it. Domestically, we have a fabulous market. 350 million people, basically tariff-free. We can trade between the states. Europe, a market about the same size, had barriers between all the countries, between Germany, France, and Holland, and Italy, and Spain. And once they eliminated all these barriers between the countries in the European Union, prosperity increased enormously in the 1970s and 80s and 90s. And they are a lot better off than they would have been with all the barriers there. So the same thing will happen on the global scene, and we'll all be better off.
question from the audience.
Yes,
John
what's the chance that we will get the better solution from Congress instead of the solution that we have from the president?
Excellent question. I mean, your guess is as good as mine. Our government deficits have been growing like crazy in the last 2 decades. And that is something that we really have to address. It's always easy to spend, and nobody wants to raise the taxes to do it. And raising the taxes, there's a limit to the amount of taxes that you can impose on the population as a whole. So I think government spending is the problem. It's not that we don't tax enough. And even when we did the tax cut last year, total revenues, government revenues, increased, but our spending increased even more. And that's why the deficit is continuing to grow. Now, with a Democrat House and a Republican Senate, you tell me what will happen. I hope nothing, because gridlock is a good thing in Washington, as far as I'm concerned.
So let's talk about the timeline. Talk to us about the timeline from implementation of tariffs to higher prices to consumers. What's the chain or the domino effect?
It's pretty fast. And we see it starting to happen right now in the United States. Because we have imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum, you know, the producers that use a lot of these metals, they are starting to raise their prices. Producer prices have started to increase the last couple of months. Not an awful lot yet, but it hurts. And if you are importing something from China, where you now have tariffs to pay, you know, either you have your margins enormously reduced, or you have to increase your prices. Next question is, do you have that pricing power, or will your customers just stay away? So it will squeeze the U.S. Industry, and it's actually a fairly fast process. A couple of months is the answer for it to feed through.
Yes, sir. Stand up when you, the question, sir.
Bob, I fully agree with you that tariff as such is bad and we have benefited with the low tariff. However, when you look at the uncertainty, the threat of tariff that Trump is bringing to the equation, look what it happens is creates the kinds of doubt where long-term investment and long-term economic impact of it is going to be devastating. When you look at it, China has become more and more dependent on us by having the $300 billion deficit, and as long as they're holding dollar as a reserve currency, I think we're getting the benefit of it in form of cheaper products coming here, and they're holding our papers.
Well, cheaper product coming here, and they're holding our papers, but they're in, I mean, our government debts, our treasury obligations. And therein lies the rub. Eventually, we have to pay it back. And if you keep running a government deficit all the time, and you keep piling up the debt, there comes a time when you feel like Greece, which has been doing that wonderfully, feel like Italy, which is trying to do it right now. So there's an end to that equation. You can't keep on running just a printing press and say, you hold the money, you hold the debt, didn't cost me much, I get the cars. Eventually, you got to pay the piper. And we're all old folks here. Our grandchildren, our children, they have to pay the bill pretty soon. So that's your trade-off. You want to live at the expense of your grandkids or not? That's a decision we got to make. And we just can't go on borrowing forever.
So, Bob, we're in a capitalist economy. The Chinese have more or less a control economy. Can you talk about the relationship between monetary policy and tariffs? How could they use monetary policy to, eliminate the effect of tariffs?
The U.S.?
The Chinese. How can they use monetary policy?
I don't think monetary policy is that important in China. They live, as you said, Ram, they live in a controlled environment, they live in a controlled economy, and the banks will lend the money to the industries that are favored by the government, where the government says, okay, these are strategic industries, we want to invest in them. The Chinese banks will lend the money to them, and that's the way it goes in a controlled economy. It's basically centrally steered according to the wishes of the ruling party.
So they can't use that as a way to obviate the effect of tariffs? We've been hearing people talk in the press about that. That's why I'm asking you.
I don't really see it, that the monetary policy would be able to have a lot of bite in there. You know, monetary policy basically, think about it in the end. Monetary policy does one thing, and that is influence the price level. So the whole price level will go up or down in the country. And then if you have an exchange rate that offsets that, flexible exchange rates, so the net result is basically zero. And I don't think Chinese monetary policy will be really an influence there.
Great. Another question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was wondering, our country's deficit, of course, is Communist China's surplus. However, and I agree with everything that you said to this point. However, I have a conflicting perception also. I see that as long as they actually have a surplus of unbacked fiat currency, aren't we actually exporting in our inflation or sharing it with the Communist Chinese? And that as long as there's the dollar remains the world reserve currency, we actually tend to benefit. But that kind of conflicts with what you said previously, which I also look at. I've been pondering that for a while.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. If we just print money and the other countries are willing to hold that money, that is, we're having a good bargain. Remember the day that you have to pay back that debt. And that's what print more. Okay, good luck. Look at countries again. Look at Greece, which kept the printing press running for a long time. Now they're in the European Union. They just kept spending in addition. They couldn't quite print the money anymore. So, but eventually they ran out of the willingness of the Germans and other European countries to finance their deficits. And that's what the argument is this week with Italy. Italy says, okay, we're going to run a big government deficit. Just spend it. And the other countries say, oh, no, not so fast. We are not going to finance your government deficit. Yes, sir.
But we still have the world reserve currency. World reserve currency.
You say we still have the reserve currency. Yes, that is what the French, General de Gaulle, and later on Giscard d'Estaing called the exorbitant privilege of the United States. And other countries don't like it. And we cannot go on forever with that. We will lose our status as the world reserve currency if we just keep printing the dollars. Anything you keep producing ad infinitum will become worth less, and therefore people will not value it anymore, will not hold it anymore. Countries around the world are already substituting euros, a little bit Chinese renminbi, and so on, in their reserve currency portfolio. We cannot go on forever. We have to have a stable, a strong dollar, and a stable and strong dollar means no inflation in the United States. I'm not happy with 2% inflation in the United States.
After China, what country has the most protectionist trade policy?
Oh, there are a lot of the small countries. Korea has high protective barriers. A lot of the Southeast Asian countries have high protective barriers. There are a lot of the African countries, but they're fairly poor countries overall. Don't make that big a difference. China has it's not only a big country, but it also has the export power to produce. So while others have high protective barriers, like I said in my talk, the Canadians, for instance, their whole cheese and milk market, all of that, is tightly regulated. Every farmer has his quota. And so, in a regime like that, where every farmer is allowed to have 2 cows or 3 cows, and the government tells you how much milk the cows are allowed to produce, if you open up your border suddenly to a neighbor next door, the United States, and let all the milk come in that comes in, that ruins that whole system. When you have a dirigist economy, if you want to call it that way, the free market is not compatible with it. And one thing that would have been nice for the Canadians if they would eliminate all these barriers. But then again, they say, okay, we want to protect our farmers. And every farmer gets a cow. In Japan, every little farmer has his rice paddy. Very, very inefficient production. And they are protected. And I hear somebody say, you're absolutely right, they vote. And that's how the governments protect these very inefficient industries.
So, do you recognize that the Chinese are essentially stealing intellectual property? And if not tariffs, what would you use to stop them from doing that?
Difficult to do. The Chinese have to take the lead there. If you have theft taken place, you need the police to do it. If your neighbor keeps stealing stuff from your backyard, you need somebody to enforce the rules. And unless you want to get in a fist fight with your neighbor, that's the force of the police. And so China has to police, has to push for the elimination, or let's put it the other way around. China has to enforce intellectual property rights. And then people will get paid proper royalties, or the stealing itself has to stop.
Question over here.
Bob, hi. If we have $358 billion a year trade deficit now with China, what would we have if all of the trade tariffs were eliminated? What is the real marginal difference in our trade?
Good question. Obviously, there are a couple of factors that play into it. One important one is the exchange rate between the United States and the renminbi, and second, trade doesn't have to be balanced bilaterally, but it has to be balanced multilaterally. And that's the important thing, so that the United States, we may not gain it towards China, but if China imports more from Germany and Germany imports more from the United States, then you have balanced trade. Ideally, you have roughly balanced trade between the two countries. And I think Trump thinks a lot about in bilateral relationships. So he sees one big problem here, and he says, well, then I want them to buy more American goods, and that would be all for the better. Let them buy more agricultural goods. Let them buy more, meat products that the Chinese pay very highly for right now. So we can export a lot more to the Chinese than we currently do. And if the Chinese buy more machines from Germany, and the Germans buy more goods from us, more wine from the Napa Valley or wherever, then multilateral basis trade can be balanced, and the exchange rates can play an important role in that balancing if you let the exchange rates fluctuate between the countries.
So nobody shoots their customer. There are those who say that international trade is a major defense strategy and that international trade is good for keeping the peace. What do you say about that?
Yes, trade is good for keeping the peace, unless it leads to quarrels. If you have big trade relations and you're dependent on each other, then you tend to reduce, then you're dependent to each other, then the incentive to attack the other country is reduced. And I think the Europeans very much recognize that. For the last 100 years, we've had two very major wars on the European continent. A lot of it was fought for commercial purposes, and as a result, everybody lost hugely. So,
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Hi, I very much appreciate your conversation. My name is Eric Anderson. I'm a guest here. I have like a multi-pronged question about inflation, the debt, the demographic cliff, our children, because we haven't increased our productivity, or we're not able to have increased productivity. So my question is related to, I do not have confidence that our Congress will ever be able to lower the debt because it's a third rail. And so how do you gain confidence when you gave your discussion that reducing debt would even be possible?
I fully agree with you. I have very little confidence either that they will do it. Neither political party has the backbone to say, we want to spend less. Eventually, there comes a point where the United States, even the United States, will run out of running room. Right now, if you look at the total debt, it's roughly equal to the total GDP. Greece hit the wall at 140% when the total debt was equal to 140% of GDP. In the next couple of weeks and months, you will see big debates. Interest rates are rising. The federal debt has to be rolled over. And as a result, the debt servicing cost in the United States will increase rapidly. Within the next 4 or 5 years, that will be next to the Medicare and medical and expenses and the Social Security. It will be bigger than the defense budget. Just think about that. Interest payments will be bigger than the defense budget.
Which is $600 billion annually.
Yeah. And, you know, interest rates going up and the deficit, I mean, the total debt continuing to rise. When you get to magnitudes like that, people will wake up. And I don't know what the solution will be. Politicians tend to think, you know, after me, the deluge. As long as it doesn't happen on my watch. 4 years from now, we will take care of it. But it can't continue like that. We've had, in California, individual towns go belly up. States are pressed. Those will be the early warning signs. Not far in the future, in our lifetime, the federal government will get into big trouble.
So we're talking about the debt we have, or the trade deficit we have with China. Across the Atlantic, Brexit. Talk to us a little bit about the economic effect of Brexit for the different parties.
Frankly, I don't know enough about exactly how Brexit will be resolved, and we haven't heard yet what the final solution will be. Britain had a good relationship, but Britain was also paying very much in transfer payments to the Europeans. There are a lot of people in Britain who didn't like the migration problem that came with being open to all of Europe. And that's an issue that is also faced by several other European countries. Look at Angela Merkel. She's on her last leg now, on the way out, right? What caused it? The key cause was 2015, when 1.5 million refugees came across the border, which caused several, not only one, 2, 3, 4 new political parties being formed. Enormous shift from the government parties, the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats. They each lost 10% of their voters to the extreme parties on the right and on the left. Right and left. The Greens, who are for open migration, gained enormously, as well as the AfD party, which is totally against migration. They gained. Overall, you know, it created big new tensions within Europe, and if Britain leaves, you know, there may be others that may say, okay, we're going to leave too. You remember 2 years ago we had the debate whether Greece should leave, would leave. If the Italians follow the Greek footsteps, they may say, let's leave. Europe has a lot of internal problems, and a lot of it is an overreaching by the European bureaucracy which tries to get into every nook and cranny, tell every Frenchman how to make his cheese, and that's when the Frenchmen get upset.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, we've seen a reduction in trade barriers over the years until this recent speed bump. I was wondering if you could address what mechanisms you think are most effective in addressing the reduction of these trade barriers, and if you could briefly touch on the WTO and their role.
Yes, the World Trade Organization, which succeeded what was known as GATT, the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, the World Trade Organization basically gives you a conflict resolution mechanism. So if somebody doesn't obey the rules that have been agreed upon, if people engage, for instance, in dumping, then you can take it to a court at the World Trade Organization in Geneva, and they will have a panel and they will try to sort out the issues and render judgment. It takes a long time, and 3 years are sort of the typical length for something to be adjudicated. Now, if you run a small company and you're exporting, or you used to export, and there's somebody foreigner who now has a tariff wall and they're producing their own, 3 years may drive you out of business. And then what do you got? Nothing. So the World Trade Organization is a good organization. It is clumsy, it is slow, and I think it needs to rejuvenate it. It got to be faster, more agile, and again, think about the ideal again, as far as I'm concerned, would be to have a regime similar to the United States domestic market, where trade is free. You can export from California to Illinois or Idaho, whatever you want to export, and if there's a problem, then it is fairly swift justice, and formal barriers are not allowed. That's the ideal system for the world as a whole, and so Trump thinks he can do it by attacking the barriers, by building your own barrier, and therefore forcing the other guy to also reduce his.
John McNeil, staff commenter John McNeil.
Thank you. Commodore, you've described a situation that has a whole laundry list of very painful chores to be accomplished in all parts of the world, but very importantly in our own. In my experience, change is good, and those are changes. It's the pace of change that'll kill you. And the organizations you just spoke of, I would hope can be constructed in some manner to manage the pace of change so that we don't kill the chicken.
Yes, John, fully agree with you. Wise words. Everything that, yes. But the pace of change is, there are two aspects to it, right? Too fast change is painful, and not making the change will also be painful. It's painful on the other side. So it's a tough balance. It's a tough balance. Again, think about Congress. How fast can Congress change things? Very slow, and usually we tend to push it out into the future. In Germany, there's a nice little medieval town called Regensburg. And if you go there and you look at the town in City Hall, they have a long bench. And all the proposals or the petitions by the citizens of Regensburg, you had your little write-up and you got to sit on that bench, and then slowly would move towards the other end. And they called it die Sache auf die lange Bank schieben. You push it on the long bench. And it means it takes forever to get there. You got to move faster. You can't wait forever either. Yes, sir.
Harvey Goldstein. Glasser. Go ahead, Harvey Glasser. What's the question?
You mentioned that the solution to some of this, to the debt issue, would be diminished government spending. But we are presently borrowing 40% of every dollar the government spends, which means our taxes are only 60% of what we're spending. with that kind of a balance and the increase in taxes or in interest on the national debt and the entitlements you mentioned, how can the government possibly diminish its expenditures?
Well, you got a good point. Now, that's why you elect your wise senators and congressmen, right? They are supposed to do that. They are supposed to come up with a budget, and they are not doing it. You're absolutely right. There's the political will is not there to set our house in order. You know, you have on a small scale, little cities here in the state of California. Some of them run a very tight budget. They're balanced every year. Everything is wonderful. Other cities not. And that's the difference between good government and bad government. And I hate to say it, we don't have really good, responsible government in the fiscal arena. I agree with you.
Yes, sir.
Bob, do you have a vision at all of what a good tariff agreement between the United States and China would look like?
The ideal one is no tariffs. Well, you want to get close to that. You know, I'm not so sure how, with nothing of that is going to happen. The Chinese have certain advantages, and you know they would get an advantage from low tariffs. Look at the Europeans with the automobile industry. They already say, okay, 0 tariffs everywhere. The Germans are for it. You know, they may think, okay, not that many Dodges will be sold in Munich, you know, when you can have a Mercedes or a BMW produced right next door. And there's some to that. But, you know, it just means the U.S. has to become more competitive. And it wasn't always that way. General Motors owned Opel, one of the big automobile manufacturers in Germany. Ford owned Ford Germany. They were building very competitive cars. The U.S., it's not that we cannot do it, but Ford and General Motors have fallen woefully behind the last 20 years or so in the technology that people lose. Now, when we're sitting there 20 years from now, who knows? Maybe we'll all be driving around in Google cars or something like that, right?
Or riding in Google cars.
Riding, yeah, not driving. No more steering wheel.
Right.
Exactly. So, and maybe Google will take over the German automobile industry. The hell with the Volkswagens.
Last question goes to our guest from Corinthian Yacht Club, Hans.
Yes. You talk about all the goods are going up quite a bit in the future. I was talking to a general contractor last week. His increase of lumber went up 28%. I mean, all the houses we lost in the fire, that's be a hell of a big increase on housing. Can we expect all the goods going up that much?
Well, you have a good point, which is true. The construction cost here, especially in the Bay Area, has risen enormously because of the fires. And keep also in mind the Bay Area is booming. And there are a lot of companies, especially down in the Silicon Valley, that say, build it, never mind what, you know. So the construction cost is increasing very strongly. And what we've got to do is have more forests that can be used for productive purposes instead of firewood. You know, allow people to go harvest the forest again, do some good forest management, cut the trees, make lumber out of them. We used to have a thriving lumber business in Northern California. Well, now it's mostly spotted owls. But then they lost their homes too. I'm not against the spotted owl, but I think you can have well-managed forests, and that will help to reduce the cost of lumber eventually. But you've got to be able to, you know, use the lumber as well, not just say, this is sacrosanct and that is sacrosanct.
So thank you for joining the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon today. Our guest has been Dr. Robert Heller, economist, PhD, and staff commodore of our good neighbor to the North, San Francisco Yacht Club. With that, the meeting is adjourned. Good going. Lots of good questions.